That pile of rotting filth will cost you $5,000, Mr. Jensen, and that's just the start. Get it gone by Friday, or we'll have it removed for you and bill you for the privilege." The words, laced with a venomous sort of glee, hung in the crisp autumn air, fouling the scent of pine and damp earth. Karen, the self-appointed queen of our little suburban fiefdom and president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, stood on the edge of my property line as if my lawn might suddenly develop a taste for polyester tracksuits. Her arms were crossed so tightly over her expansive chest that the fabric of her pink velour jacket strained at the seams, and her face, a mask of indignant fury, was flushed a shade that clashed violently with her platinum blonde helmet of hair. She gestured with a dismissive flick of her wrist toward my compost enclosure, a neat three-bin system I'd built myself from reclaimed cedar, as if she were pointing at a pile of plague-ridden corpses. It was a masterpiece of controlled decomposition, a testament to patience and biology, layered with greens and browns, turned religiously, and smelling of nothing more than rich, loamy soil. But in her eyes, it was a declaration of war against the beige, manicured sterility she worshipped. $5,000. The number was so absurd, so cartoonishly villainous, that for a moment I thought I'd misheard. But the look in her eyes, that cold, predatory glint of someone who enjoys wielding petty power, told me she was dead serious. This wasn't about a compost pile. This was about control, and I was the latest nail that needed to be hammered down. If you've ever found yourself on the receiving end of a power trip like this, you know exactly the kind of cold, slow-burning anger that started to kindle in my gut. Hit that subscribe button if you're ready for a story about what happens when they push a quiet man too far. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or share your own HOA nightmare. You're not going to want to miss how this ends. Now back to that Tuesday morning that changed everything. My name is Marcus Jensen, and for 20 years my world was the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I built things, I fixed things, and I solved problems, often under conditions that made a suburban cul-de-sac feel like a five-star resort. My life was governed by regulations, standard operating procedures, and a clear chain of command. I understood rules. More importantly, I understood the purpose behind them. When I retired, all my wife, Sarah, and I wanted was a little piece of quiet, a place to put down roots, literally. We bought a modest house on a half-acre lot at the edge of the Whispering Pines development, specifically because it backed up to a stretch of protected woodland. It was the perfect blend of community and privacy. I could have my workshop, my garden, and yes, my compost pile, while Sarah could join the book club and have neighbors to chat with. For 2 years, it was exactly that. I built my garden beds, installed a rainwater collection system, and constructed the aforementioned compost station. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could turn the waste of today into the bounty of tomorrow. It was efficient, clean, and entirely self-contained. I followed every best practice, every county guideline. It generated no odor, attracted no pests, and was tucked away behind a tasteful lattice screen I'd put up, not because I was required to, but because I'm a considerate neighbor. Karen, however, did not see it that way. She had been elected HOA president on a platform of protecting our property values, which was her dog whistle for enforcing a soul-crushing uniformity. Her reign began with a crusade against unapproved mailbox colors and escalated to measuring the height of residents' grass with a ruler. She patrolled the streets in her golf cart, a clipboard her scepter, and a scowl her crown, dispensing violation notices like a parking meter maid on a power trip. I had managed to stay off her radar, mostly by being meticulous. My lawn was edged, my hedges were trimmed, my trash cans were never visible from the street except on collection day. I was the model resident, the gray man, but my compost pile, a symbol of self-sufficiency and a rejection of the disposable mindset, was an affront she simply could not tolerate. It was different. It was productive. It wasn't something you could buy from the approved landscape supplier. And so that Tuesday, she made her move. $5,000, I repeated, keeping my voice level, a skill honed by years of de-escalating situations far more dangerous than this. Karen, what bylaw am I supposedly violating? She puffed herself up, producing the clipboard from the passenger seat of her golf cart. Bylaw 7, Section C, Paragraph 4, she announced, her voice dripping with triumph. Prohibition of unsightly storage of debris, refuse, or rubbish. I glanced back at my compost system. The cedar was silvering nicely in the weather. The hardware was stainless steel. The ground around it was swept clean. Karen, this is not refuse or rubbish. This is organic material undergoing a controlled process. It's garden soil in the making. There's a scientific difference. Her eyes narrowed. It looks like a trash heap to me, Mr. Jensen, and I am the sole arbiter of what constitutes unsightly in this community. Your neighbors have complained. I knew for a fact that was a lie. My immediate neighbors, the Hendersons, were retired teachers who were fascinated by the process. John Henderson often came over to ask for advice on his own sad-looking tomato plants. Which neighbors? I asked, my voice still calm, but with a new edge of steel. I'm not required to disclose that, she snapped, her confidence wavering for just a fraction of a second. The point is, the violation has been noted. You have until Friday. After that, the daily fines begin. $100 a day, retroactive to today, and we will be placing a lien on your property for the initial fine. A lien, that was the nuclear option. A legal claim against my home, all for a pile of leaves and coffee grounds. The cold anger in my gut began to sharpen into something else entirely. Focus. This wasn't a disagreement anymore. This was a declaration of war. She had chosen her battlefield, and she had just handed me my mission parameters. She thought she was dealing with some weekend gardener. She was about to find out she was dealing with a combat engineer who saw this not as a problem, but as a project. Project name, Deconstruct Karen. And I always finish my projects. The golf cart whined away, leaving a trail of smug satisfaction and the faint smell of battery acid in its wake. I stood there for a long moment, the official violation notice clutched in my hand. It was printed on thick, creamy cardstock, the HOA logo, 2 whispery pine trees locked in an unnervingly close embrace, embossed in gold at the top. Everything about it was designed to look official, to intimidate, to create the illusion of unassailable authority. $5,000 for unsightly storage of refuse, $100 a day for noncompliance. The threat of a lien. It was a classic shock and awe tactic designed to overwhelm and force a quick surrender. But I don't shock easily. I took a deep, steadying breath, the clean, earthy scent of my supposed refuse filling my lungs. This was not a moment for anger. It was a moment for process. Back in my workshop, surrounded by the comforting order of neatly arranged tools and half-finished projects, I laid the violation notice on my workbench. I took a high-resolution photo of it with my phone. Then I went back outside and took photos of my compost enclosure from every conceivable angle, wide shots showing its discreet placement, close-ups of the tidy layers of nitrogen-rich greens and carbon-rich browns, even a shot from my neighbor's property line, with his permission, to show it was barely visible. I documented the lack of any smell, the absence of any pests. I even took a video where I plunged a compost thermometer into the heart of the pile, showing the needle climb to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, the perfect temperature for active, healthy decomposition that kills pathogens and weed seeds. This was step 1. Establish the ground truth. The facts, uncolored by Karen's hysterical interpretation. Next, I went to my office and pulled out the binder I'd received when we closed on the house. The Whispering Pines HOA covenants, conditions and restrictions, all 200 pages of it. I read Bylaw 7, Section C, Paragraph 4. The storage of debris, refuse, rubbish, or other unsightly materials on any lot is prohibited. The determination of what constitutes unsightly material shall be at the sole discretion of the Architectural Control Committee. There it was, the poison pill. Sole discretion. It was a deliberately vague, tyrannical little clause designed to give the board, and by extension its president, dictatorial power. But it wasn't a checkmate. I spent the next 2 hours reading the entire document, cover to cover, highlighting every section related to violations, appeals, committee powers, and resident rights. I found the appeals process. A homeowner had the right to a formal hearing before the full board, provided they submitted a written appeal within 10 days. It was a small window, but it was a window. I began to draft my appeal. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a technical document. I started by formally refuting the classification of my compost as refuse or rubbish, citing definitions from the EPA and the Department of Agriculture. I attached a detailed explanation of the hot composting method, complete with diagrams, explaining how the process was controlled, hygienic, and beneficial. I argued that the material was not being stored but was in process, similar to dough rising on a counter or paint drying on a canvas. It was a transitional state, not a final one. Then I addressed the unsightly claim. I included the photographs I had taken, contrasting them with the dictionary definition of unsightly, unpleasant or offensive to look at. I argued that a neat, cedar-clad structure was objectively not offensive, and that Karen's sole discretion was being wielded in an arbitrary and capricious manner, which was grounds for a legal challenge under state property law. I cited the specific statute. Finally, I included a printout of our county's own guide to home composting, which actively encouraged the practice as a means of reducing landfill waste. I pointed out that the HOA's actions were in direct opposition to the county's stated environmental goals. I printed 3 copies, put them in crisp manila envelopes, and drove to the post office. I sent one to the official HOA mailing address, addressed to the board of directors. I sent the second directly to Karen's home address. Both were sent via certified mail with return receipt requested. The third copy was for my file. The Karen file, as I'd already started calling it. As I drove home, a plan was solidifying in my mind. The appeal was just the opening move, a way to formalize the dispute and put them on the clock. Karen wanted to use paperwork as a weapon, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I had managed logistics for battalion-sized operations. I could drown her in documentation. When I got back, Sarah was home. She saw the look on my face. "What did she do?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. I explained the situation, the fine, the lien threat. Her face paled. $5,000? Marcus, that's insane. Can she do that? "She thinks she can," I said, putting my arm around her. "But she's made a mistake. She's picked a fight with the wrong guy." That evening, I didn't work in my shop. I sat at my computer and began a different kind of project. I created a new folder on my hard drive. I created spreadsheets. The first was a timeline, logging the date, time, and summary of every interaction with Karen, starting with that morning's confrontation. The second was a list of potential allies, starting with my neighbor, John Henderson. The third was a database of every bylaw, cross-referenced with potential weaknesses and contradictions. Karen had started this with a single, poorly written violation notice. I was going to counter with an overwhelming barrage of facts, evidence, and procedure. She wanted a war of attrition? Fine. I had the discipline and the patience to last her out. She was operating on ego and emotion. I was operating on logic and strategy, and in the end, logic and strategy always win. The first shot had been fired, and I had returned fire with a precisely aimed round of certified mail. Now we wait for the enemy to reveal their next move. The return receipt for my certified letter to Karen arrived 3 days later, the little green card bearing her spiky, indignant signature. The official receipt from the HOA's management company followed the day after. The clock was now ticking for them, not me. They had, according to their own bylaws, 15 business days to schedule my appeal hearing. In the meantime, the Friday deadline for removing my filth came and went. My compost pile remained, happily cooking away behind its lattice screen. I half expected Karen to show up with a front-end loader and a gang of hired goons, but the day passed with an unnerving silence. The $100 daily fines were theoretically accumulating, but they were now contingent on the outcome of the appeal. It was a high-stakes waiting game. But I don't wait idly. I use that time for reconnaissance. On Saturday morning, I saw John Henderson out wrestling with his lawnmower. I wandered over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Morning, John. Looks like that carburetor is giving you trouble again." He sighed, wiping grease from his hands. "Tells me every spring it's going to behave, and then it pulls this nonsense. Thanks, Marcus." We stood there for a minute, sipping the coffee. Listen, I said, keeping my tone casual. I need to ask you something. Has my compost setup ever bothered you? Any smells, any pests, anything at all? John looked genuinely confused. The little wooden box thing? Bothered me? Marcus, the only thing that bothers me is that your tomatoes will probably be twice the size of mine again this year because of it. Why do you ask? I told him about Karen's visit, the fine, the whole ridiculous affair. His face hardened. She said neighbors complained? That woman is a piece of work. She cornered Mary last month about the welcome mat, said the font wasn't on the approved list of classic typefaces. A welcome mat. This was gold. I hadn't come over to recruit him, only to confirm he wasn't the source of the complaint, but he was offering up a new piece of the puzzle. What did you do? I asked. Mary went online and ordered a new one. It wasn't worth the fight. We're retired, Marcus. We don't have the energy for that kind of battle. And that was her strategy in a nutshell. She targeted people she knew would fold. The elderly, the busy families, people who would rather pay a $50 fine for a slightly too jolly snowman than deal with the headache of fighting it. She was a bully who picked her victims carefully, but she had miscalculated with me. I had the time, I had the energy, and most importantly, I had the training. The next phase of Karen's attack came not in person, but through the HOA's monthly newsletter, The Whispering Pines Whisperer. It was usually a bland affair filled with reminders about lawn fertilization schedules and a recipe for 7-layer dip. But this month, there was a new prominently featured section titled Community Standards Spotlight. It didn't mention my name, but it didn't have to. It has come to the board's attention, the article began in Karen's florid passive-aggressive prose, that some residents are engaging in practices that may pose a health and sanitation risk to our community. The storage of open or improperly contained household and yard waste can attract vermin, create foul odors, and negatively impact the aesthetic harmony we all work so hard to maintain. It went on, a masterpiece of innuendo and scaremongering. It talked about rats, disease, and declining property values. And right next to the article was a photograph. It was my compost pile, but taken from a bizarre low angle through a gap in the lattice on a cloudy day. The wide-angle lens distorted the neat cedar box, making it look like a sprawling, chaotic mound. She had trespassed on my property to take it. The rage that had been a cold, controlled ember now flared hot. This was no longer just about a bylaw. This was a calculated, public smear campaign. She was trying to poison my reputation and turn my neighbors against me before I even had my hearing. Sarah was furious. She came onto our property to take that picture. That's illegal, isn't it? It is, I said, my voice grim, as I saved a PDF of the newsletter to the Karen file. And we'll get to that, but this is actually a gift. A gift, Marcus? She's calling you a health hazard in front of the entire neighborhood. She's overplaying her hand, I explained, pulling up the photo on my monitor and zooming in. She thinks she's being clever, but she's creating a paper trail of her own malice. Look. I pointed to the timestamp embedded in the digital file of the newsletter PDF. Then I pointed to the photo itself. She's showing everyone her weapon, and in doing so, she's also showing us how to disarm it. The article had the exact effect Karen intended. A few neighbors who I only knew to wave at now averted their eyes when I walked my dog. I overheard a woman at the community mailbox whisper to another about the hoarder on Chestnut Lane. The poison was working, but it also had an unintended side effect. It flushed out allies. That afternoon, a man I recognized from a few streets over knocked on my door. He was tall, wiry, with a no-nonsense haircut and the unmistakable bearing of a fellow serviceman. Marcus Jensen? He asked. I'm Dave Sterling, retired Air Force. I read the newsletter. Come on in, Dave, I said. He sat at our kitchen table refusing a drink. He got straight to the point. That was about you, wasn't it? The compost pile. I nodded. Last year, he said, his voice tight, Karen tried to fine me $2,000 because the American flag I fly on holidays was, and I quote, of a non-standard, oversized dimension that detracts from the uniform streetscape. She wanted me to replace my 6-foot flagpole with one of the dinky little 4-foot banner poles. I told her to pound sand. She backed down when I got a lawyer from the VFW to send her a letter, but she's had it out for me ever since. We talked for an hour. His story was one of many. A family with a special needs child was harassed over a small, temporary therapy swing in their front yard. A woman was fined because her wind chimes were deemed excessively tonal. It was a clear, undeniable pattern of abuse, all meticulously documented by Karen in her quest for absolute control. By the time Dave left, my potential allies spreadsheet had a lot more names on it. And I had a new piece of my strategy. Karen thought this was a one-on-one fight. I was going to make it a multi-front war. The notice for my hearing arrived a few days later. It was scheduled for a week from Tuesday in the community clubhouse. My appeal was on the agenda, sandwiched between a vote on new petunias for the front entrance and a discussion about resurfacing the tennis courts. She was trying to bury it, to treat it as a trivial administrative matter, but I had no intention of letting it be trivial. I spent the next week preparing. I wasn't just preparing to defend my compost pile, I was preparing to prosecute Karen. I put together a binder. My binder. It had tab sections: bylaw analysis, photo evidence, correspondence, precedents of abuse, with Dave's and others' permission, and legal standing. It was thick, it was organized, and it was irrefutable. I was going to walk into that meeting and dismantle her argument piece by piece, fact by fact. But as I was reviewing my photos, something else caught my eye. It was an older picture I had taken of my backyard before the compost fight began. In the background, far across the common green space, was the official HOA community garden. It was Karen's baby, her pride and joy. She had secured a huge budget for it, and she managed it like a tyrant, assigning plots and dictating what could be grown. And in the corner of the garden, barely visible in my photo, were some large black plastic bins, the community compost area. A thought, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, lodged itself in my mind. You want to talk about sanitation and vermin, Karen? Let's talk. The week leading up to the board meeting was a masterclass in psychological warfare, orchestrated by Karen. 2 days after the newsletter, a new violation notice appeared on my door, this one for failure to comply with the first notice. It included a running tally of the daily fines, which had now reached an eye-watering sum. It was another scare tactic, a bit of paper meant to make me feel overwhelmed and hopeless. I photographed it, filed it, and ignored it. The real battle wasn't on my doorstep. It was in the hearts and minds of my neighbors, and it was on the legal ground I was meticulously preparing. But the seed of an idea planted by that old photograph of the community garden had taken root. That afternoon, I took a walk. My route, seemingly casual, took me along the public path that bordered the green space where Karen's prized garden was located. From a distance, it looked idyllic. Raised beds overflowed with late-season kale and chard, and a charming little gazebo sat in the center. But as I got closer, my engineer's eye for detail started picking up on discrepancies. The community compost area, unlike my contained and balanced system, was a disaster waiting to happen. It consisted of 4 large, open-top plastic bins, the kind you might buy at a home improvement store for storing holiday decorations. They were overflowing. I could see whole heads of lettuce, rotting pumpkins from a recent fall festival, and what looked like greasy pizza boxes peeking out from the mess. There was no evidence of proper layering with brown materials, no sign that it was ever turned. It was just a wet, stinking pile of kitchen scraps. And the smell. From 50 yards away, with the wind just right, I caught it. It wasn't the rich, earthy scent of healthy compost. It was the sour, fetid stench of anaerobic decay, the smell of garbage. I took a few discreet photos with my phone's telephoto lens, careful not to step onto the common area that the garden occupied. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. She was trying to crucify me for a perfectly managed system while presiding over a literal garbage heap in the center of our community. This was no longer just about hypocrisy, it was about negligence. That evening, I called Dave Sterling. Dave, Marcus, I need your opinion on something. How do you feel about the community garden? There was a pause. It's Karen's little kingdom, he said. Well, I think she's running a less than hygienic operation over there, specifically her composting method. I could almost hear him shrug over the phone. Wouldn't surprise me. She's all about appearances, not substance. The front of that garden looks great, but I've heard people who have plots complain that the soil is terrible and the water spigots are always broken. I want you to do me a favor, I said. Next time you walk your dog, swing by there. Don't be obvious. Just take a look at the compost bins in the back corner. Tell me what you see and what you smell. 2 days later, he called back. His voice was grim. You were right, Marcus. That's not a compost pile, it's a dumpster. And I saw something else. I saw a rat, a big one, darted out from under one of the bins and disappeared into the woods. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My compost pile, which was sealed, balanced, and generated internal temperatures high enough to sterilize it, was a non-issue. Her open-air, all-you-can-eat buffet of rotting food was a 5-star resort for every rodent in a 5-mile radius. She wasn't just a hypocrite, she was a public health menace. The night before the board meeting, Sarah and I sat at the dining room table, my binder open between us. It was now even thicker, with a new section titled Community Garden Analysis, complete with my photos, Dave's eyewitness account, and a printout of the county health code regulations regarding vermin control and solid waste disposal. Are you sure about this, Marcus? Sarah asked, her brow furrowed with worry. You're not just defending yourself anymore. You're accusing her. This is going to get ugly. It's already ugly, I replied, closing the binder with a decisive snap. She made it ugly when she lied about my neighbors, when she trespassed to take that picture, and when she tried to smear me in that newsletter. She wants to have a public hearing about health and sanitation? Fine, let's have one. But we're going to discuss all the health and sanitation issues in Whispering Pines, not just the imaginary ones on my property. The meeting was at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. It was a sterile, multi-purpose room with fluorescent lights and stacking chairs, smelling faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. About 30 residents were there, more than usual. The newsletter article had drawn a crowd. Some were there to gawk at the hoarder. Others, like Dave and a few folks he'd spoken to, were there as quiet support. The board sat at a long table at the front, Karen in the center, flanked by 4 other residents. 2 of them, a timid-looking man named Gary and a woman who seemed permanently attached to her phone, were clearly her puppets. The other 2, a sharp-looking lawyer named Maria and a retired accountant named Frank, seemed more independent, their expressions neutral. Karen called the meeting to order, her voice booming with self-importance. They droned through the approval of the last meeting's minutes and the Petunia budget. Then she arrived at my item on the agenda. Next, she announced, a cruel smile playing on her lips, we have the appeal of Mr. Marcus Jensen regarding violation notice 88-12 for the unsightly storage of refuse. She looked directly at me. Mr. Jensen, you have 5 minutes to explain why you believe you should be exempt from the rules that everyone else in this community is expected to follow. The room was silent. All eyes were on me. I stood up, walked to the front, and placed my binder on the table with a solid thud. I hadn't come to explain. I'd come to educate. Good evening, I began, my voice calm and clear, projecting to the back of the room. My name is Marcus Jensen. I'm not here to ask for an exemption. I'm here to state that no rule was ever broken. I opened the binder. The violation claims I am storing refuse. This is factually incorrect. For the next 10 minutes, far exceeding her arbitrary 5-minute limit, I laid out my case. I didn't rush. I spoke with the methodical precision of an engineer giving a briefing. I presented the science of composting. I showed the large, glossy photos of my neat, clean, and contained system. I contrasted them with the distorted, malicious photo from the newsletter. I read the exact text of the bylaw and then read the exact text of state property laws concerning the arbitrary and capricious enforcement of HOA rules. I could see the 2 independent board members, Maria and Frank, leaning forward, listening intently. Karen's smile had vanished, replaced by a tight, angry line. Her puppets, Gary and the woman on her phone, just looked confused. I detailed the timeline of events, including the fact that the smear tactic photo had been taken without my permission on my property. Maria, the lawyer, raised an eyebrow at that. I was building an undeniable foundation of facts, brick by brick. The residents in the audience were murmuring. They had come expecting to see a crazy hoarder defend his trash pile. Instead, they were watching a systematic, evidence-based dismantling of the HOA president's authority. I had them. They were listening, but I hadn't even gotten to the best part. I saved that for the grand finale. This was just the softening up bombardment before the main assault. In conclusion, I said, my voice resonating in the quiet room, the fine, the threats, and the public character assassination are not based on any legitimate violation of our community's bylaws. They are the result of a personal vendetta executed through the abuse of a poorly written, overly broad rule. I closed the first half of my binder. Karen, seeing her opening, pounced. A personal vendetta? Mr. Jensen, this is about maintaining standards. Your pile of rotting garbage is a health risk. The words health risk were the trigger. It was the exact word I needed her to say. A health risk, I repeated slowly, letting the phrase hang in the air. I'm glad you brought that up, Karen, because I, too, am deeply concerned about potential health risks here in Whispering Pines. I opened the second half of my binder, the one with the community garden tab. A new wave of murmuring rippled through the audience. My composting system, I continued, holding up a photo of my thermometer reading 140 degrees, is a hot composting system. It is biologically stable, generates no foul odors, and operates at a temperature that pasteurizes the material, killing any pathogens or weed seeds. It does not attract vermin because it is a closed, balanced ecosystem. I then held up one of the telephoto shots I'd taken of her community garden compost bins. The image was damning. Rotting food, greasy cardboard, a chaotic, stinking mess. This, on the other hand, I said, my voice dropping to a more serious tone, is the composting system for the community garden. The system you personally manage, Karen. Her face went from angry red to a pale, mottled white. That is irrelevant, she sputtered. We are discussing your violation. Are we? I countered, turning to address the rest of the board and the audience. Karen's violation notice and her article in the newsletter accused me of creating a health hazard that could attract vermin. I contend that the real health hazard, the real vermin magnet, is not on my private property. It's on our shared community property, funded by our HOA dues and managed directly by our president. I laid out the evidence, the photos, the description of the sour anaerobic smell. I explained the difference between my method and the dump and run method being employed at the garden. I cited the county health codes regarding the disposal of food waste and the mitigation of pests. Then I looked over at Dave Sterling, who was sitting in the front row. Dave, I said, you walk your dog past that garden every day. Have you noticed anything? Dave stood up. I have, he said, his voice steady. Last week I saw a rat, a big one. It came from under those bins, and it wasn't the first time I have seen them in that area. A collective gasp went through the room. It was one thing for me to make an accusation. It was another for a second resident to corroborate it with an eyewitness account of rats. Karen was on her feet now, her voice shrill. This is a ridiculous deflection. He's making this up to distract from his own disgusting mess. It's not a deflection, Karen, I said calmly. It's a matter of public health. Children play on that green space. Rats carry diseases. Hantavirus, leptospirosis, salmonellosis. Are you aware of the legal liability the HOA would face if a child were to get sick because of a pest infestation that we knew about and did nothing to address? Maria, the lawyer on the board, audibly cleared her throat. Her pen was flying across her notepad. Frank, the accountant, was looking at Karen with a new, deeply concerned expression. He was likely calculating the potential cost of that liability. I had changed the entire frame of the conversation. This was no longer about my compost. It was about Karen's incompetence and negligence. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, I said, delivering the final inescapable blow. In fact, I insist you don't. I move that the board, in the interest of protecting the health and safety of all residents, immediately contact the County Department of Health and request a full professional inspection of the community garden and surrounding common areas, specifically for pest infestation and waste management compliance. Checkmate. The room erupted. People were turning to their neighbors, whispering loudly. The narrative had been completely flipped. I was no longer the villain. I was the resident who had uncovered a potential crisis. Karen was trapped. If she refused the inspection, she would look guilty, like she had something to hide. If she agreed, she was walking straight into the trap I had just laid for her. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions. Fury at me, panic at the mention of the health department, and the dawning horror of her impending humiliation. "This is absurd," she stammered, looking to the other board members for support. But the support wasn't there. Gary, her puppet, was looking at the floor. The woman with the phone was actually paying attention for once, her eyes wide. Frank, the accountant, spoke up for the first time. I think Mr. Jensen has a point," he said hesitantly. "If there's even a possibility of an infestation, we have a fiduciary duty to investigate." Maria, the lawyer, nodded, her face grim. "He's right, Karen. From a liability standpoint, we cannot ignore a direct report of vermin on common property. Refusing to act would be grossly negligent." Karen looked around, her power base crumbling before her very eyes. She had lost control of the board, she had lost control of the room, and she had lost control of the narrative. Her sole discretion meant nothing in the face of public health codes and legal liability. With a voice strangled by rage, she finally choked out the words, "Fine, fine, call the health department. They won't find anything." But we both knew she was lying. And as I gathered my binder and walked back to my seat, I saw the look of pure, unadulterated hatred she shot my way. It was the look of a tyrant who had just been publicly overthrown. The vote was a formality. Maria made the motion. Frank seconded it. It passed 4-1, with Karen as the lone sputtering dissenter. The battle was over. The war, however, was just beginning, and the next phase would be fought not by me, but by the professionals. The call to the County Department of Health was made the very next morning by Maria, the board's lawyer. She was taking no chances. She framed it not as a complaint from a resident, but as a proactive request from the HOA board itself, citing concerns raised at a public meeting. It was a smart legal move, positioning the HOA as responsible and concerned, rather than reactive and negligent. It also took the onus off me entirely. I was now just the catalyst, the concerned citizen who had raised the alarm. The wheels of bureaucracy grind slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. We were told an inspector would be out within the week. During that time, a strange quiet fell over the neighborhood. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Her golf cart remained parked in her driveway, a silent monument to her diminished authority. The usual stream of violation notices ceased. It was as if the entire enforcement arm of the HOA had gone into a state of shock. The residents, however, were buzzing. The story of the board meeting had spread like wildfire. I was no longer the hoarder on Chestnut Lane. I was the guy who stood up to Karen. People I'd never spoken to before would give me a nod or a thumbs up as I walked my dog. John Henderson dropped off a 6-pack of beer on my porch with a note that just said, "Attaboy." The tide of public opinion, which Karen had tried so hard to turn against me, had reversed with the force of a tsunami. She had made this a public fight, and the public had chosen a side. I spent the waiting period reinforcing my own position. I sent a follow-up letter, certified mail of course, to the board. In it, I formally stated that pending the results of the county's investigation into the HOA's own sanitation practices, my appeal regarding my compost pile was on hold. I was, in effect, linking the two issues. My alleged health risk could not be adjudicated until the actual health risk on common property was resolved. It was a procedural move that backed them even further into a corner. 2 days later, a discreet white county vehicle pulled into the neighborhood. A woman in a polo shirt with a county logo embroidered on the chest got out, carrying a clipboard and a camera. It was happening. I watched from my window as she was met by Maria and Frank from the board. Karen was conspicuously absent. They walked together across the green space towards the community garden. The inspection took nearly 2 hours. The inspector was methodical. She took pictures, she took notes. She wore gloves and used a long metal probe to poke into the compost bins. She walked the perimeter of the garden, the edge of the woods, and the area behind the clubhouse. It was a thorough, professional assessment of the situation. I didn't need to be there to know what she was finding. The evidence was undeniable. Late that afternoon, Maria and Frank went door to door to every house on the board. They didn't call a meeting. They delivered the news in person, a sign of the gravity of the situation. When they got to my house, their faces were grim. "Marcus," Maria said, wasting no time, "we wanted to let you know the results of the inspection. It's bad." Frank, the accountant, looked physically ill. The inspector found a significant, deeply entrenched rodent infestation, specifically Norway rats. The nests are centered around the community garden's compost area, but she said the activity extends into the woodland behind it and along the creek bed. The source, Maria continued, was determined to be, and I'm quoting the preliminary report, improperly managed food waste providing a consistent and abundant food source for a thriving vermin population. She found multiple active burrows under the bins, along the fence line, and even under the decorative gazebo. They were forced to shut down the entire community garden, effective immediately. Yellow caution, "Do not enter" tape was stretched across the entrance. The county issued a formal notice of violation to the HOA. The notice came with a list of mandatory remediation steps. First, a professional pest control company had to be hired for an extensive extermination program. Second, all the existing compost, soil, and wooden structures within the garden, the raised beds, the gazebo, everything, had to be removed and disposed of as hazardous waste. Third, the entire topsoil of the garden area had to be excavated to a depth of 18 inches to destroy the burrow network. And then came the fines. There was an initial fine of $10,000 from the health department for the violation itself. On top of that, there was a $500 daily fine until the remediation plan was submitted and approved, and another daily fine until the work was completed to the county's satisfaction. Frank let out a shaky breath. The initial estimates for the pest control and the excavation, we're looking at somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000 on top of the fines. It's going to wipe out our entire reserve fund. The cost of Karen's ego and incompetence was a potential $60,000 catastrophe for the community. The $5,000 fine she had tried to levy against me for my clean, productive compost pile was now a bitter, ironic joke. "This is a direct result of Karen's mismanagement," Maria said, her voice cold and hard. "She was solely in charge of that garden. She approved the budget. She dictated the methods. This is her failure." "What happens now?" I asked. "We're calling a special emergency meeting of all homeowners," Maria said. "The bylaws allow for it if a significant portion of the board agrees, and we have the votes. The purpose of the meeting will be twofold: to authorize the expenditure for the cleanup, which we have no choice but to do, and to hold a vote of no confidence in Karen's presidency." The trap had not only been sprung, it had been more effective than I could have ever imagined. Karen's pet project, her symbol of authority, had become a toxic money pit. Her weapon of choice, accusations of health and sanitation violations, had blown up in her face with spectacular force. She had tried to burn me down and instead had set her own kingdom on fire. The special meeting was set for the following week. This time, there would be no discussion of petunias. This time, it was a trial. The week before the special meeting was electric. The official notice went out to every home via email and certified mail, a tactic I appreciated. It detailed the reason for the meeting, the health department's findings, the mandatory remediation of the community garden, the catastrophic financial implications, and a proposed vote to remove Karen from her position as president of the board of directors. There was no ambiguity, no passive-aggressive prose. It was a stark, factual indictment. The yellow tape around the garden served as a constant, visible reminder of the disaster. It became a morbid tourist attraction. Residents would walk by, shaking their heads, their anger palpable. The community that Karen had tried to rule through division and intimidation was now uniting against a common enemy, her. Dave Sterling and I became the unofficial information hub. People would stop us on the street asking for details. We didn't gossip or gloat. We stuck to the facts. We explained the health risks, the financial costs, and the clear chain of negligence that led directly back to Karen. We were calm, we were credible, and our quiet anger resonated with our neighbors. My own violation notice and the ridiculous fines were now completely forgotten, a footnote in a much larger scandal. I received a formal letter from the board, drafted by Maria, officially rescinding Violation 88-12 and all associated penalties. It included a formal apology for the unfounded accusation and the distress it caused. I photographed it and placed it in the Karen file under a new tab, Vindication. Karen, for her part, tried to mount a defense. It was a pathetic, desperate campaign. She sent out a blast email from her personal account, bypassing the official HOA channels, which Maria now controlled. In it, she portrayed herself as the victim. She claimed I had orchestrated a smear campaign and sabotaged the garden to get back at her for the violation notice. She accused me of planting rats. The accusations were so unhinged, so divorced from reality, that it had the opposite of her intended effect. It made her look pathetic and unstable. It was the digital equivalent of a cornered animal lashing out blindly. No one believed her. How could I have manufactured a years-long, deeply entrenched infestation in a matter of weeks? How could I have faked the county health inspector's report? Her email was a confession of her own paranoia and a final spectacular act of self-immolation. The night of the special meeting, the clubhouse was packed. Every chair was filled, and people were standing along the walls and in the back. There were over 100 residents there, a massive turnout. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a public reckoning. The board sat at the front table, but this time there was a space between Karen and the other members. They had physically distanced themselves from her, a visual representation of her complete isolation. Maria called the meeting to order and immediately yielded the floor to Frank, the accountant. Frank, no longer timid, stood up and walked the homeowners through the financial disaster. He presented the health department's violation notice, the quotes from the remediation companies, and the projected impact on the HOA's budget. He explained that the $60,000 cost would completely drain the reserve fund, which was meant for long-term capital projects like road repairs and roof replacements. To be clear, he said, his voice ringing with newfound confidence, this entire financial crisis, the largest in this HOA's history, is the direct result of the gross mismanagement of the community garden project. Every eye in the room turned to Karen. She sat rigid in her chair, her face a thunderous mask of fury. Maria then took the floor. She laid out the legal situation, the liability the HOA had narrowly avoided by acting quickly, and the damage to the community's reputation. She explained the process for a vote of no confidence as outlined in the bylaws. Then she opened the floor for discussion. For a moment there was silence. Then Dave Sterling stood up. My name is Dave Sterling, and he began. And for years, I and many others in this room have been subjected to the bullying, harassment, and arbitrary enforcement of our HOA president. She fined me for flying an American flag. She harassed the Miller family over a therapy swing for their child. She went after the Hendersons for their welcome mat. She created a culture of fear and intimidation to satisfy her own need for control. One by one, others stood up. Mary Henderson, her voice trembling but firm, talked about the welcome mat. Mr. Miller spoke emotionally about the stress Karen had caused his family. A dozen other stories came out, a torrent of suppressed frustration and anger unleashed. It was a pattern of abuse, laid bare for everyone to see. My own story was now just one piece of a much larger mosaic of her tyranny. Finally, I stood up. The room fell silent. My name is Marcus Jensen, I said. This started when our president tried to fine me $5,000 for my compost pile, calling it a health hazard. It ends tonight with us facing a $60,000 bill to clean up the actual health hazard that she created through her own negligence and hypocrisy. I held up the two photos, the one of my neat, clean system and the one of her overflowing vermin-infested bins. This is a picture of responsible stewardship, I said, holding up the first. And this, I held up the second, is a picture of arrogant incompetence. The choice of who you want leading this community has never been clearer. I sat down. The applause started with a few people, then grew until it was a deafening wave of support washing over me. Karen was shrunken in her chair, the applause like physical blows. Maria called for the vote, all in favor of the motion of no confidence and the immediate removal of Karen as president of the board of directors. Please say aye. The response was a deafening roar. Aye. All opposed? The silence in the room was absolute. Not a single voice, not even her own, spoke in her defense. The motion carries, Maria announced, her voice ringing with finality. Karen, you are hereby removed from the board, effective immediately. It was over. Karen stood up, her face pale, her hands shaking. She didn't say a word. She gathered her purse and walked the longest walk of her life. Out of the clubhouse, past the neighbors she had terrorized, her reign of petty tyranny finished. The room erupted in cheers. It was a moment of pure, cathartic release. Justice, swift and decisive, had been served. The aftermath of Karen's ouster was like the calm after a storm. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for years seemed to evaporate overnight. In the special election that followed, Dave Sterling was elected the new HOA president, and I was voted onto the board to fill a vacant seat. Our first official act was to approve the expenditure for the garden remediation, a bitter pill we had to swallow. But under Dave's leadership, it was presented not as a failure, but as a new beginning, a chance to rebuild correctly. The second act was a complete and total overhaul of the bylaws. Maria, Dave, and I formed a committee. We went through the entire 200-page document line by line. We ripped out every vague, subjective clause like sole discretion and unsightly. We replaced them with clear, objective, and reasonable standards. The rule about mailbox fonts, gone. The restrictions on flag sizes, gone, replaced with simple guidelines about safety and placement. The section on storage of debris was rewritten completely. It now specifically defined debris and rubbish, and, in a section I wrote myself, it explicitly protected and even encouraged responsible home composting, providing clear guidelines based on county best practices. We were transforming the HOA from an instrument of oppression into a tool for genuine community management. The cleanup of the community garden was a massive, ugly job. The exterminators came first, a grim but necessary process. Then the excavation crew arrived with a bobcat and a dump truck. They scraped the entire plot of land bare, removing Karen's gazebo, the contaminated raised beds, and tons of infested soil. It was a sad sight, a testament to the scale of her failure, but it was also a cleansing. For weeks, the former garden was just a patch of raw, brown earth, fenced off and healing. Karen put her house on the market less than a month after the meeting. The for sale sign on her lawn was a victory flag for the entire neighborhood. No one was sad to see her go. The day the moving truck came, a quiet, spontaneous block party seemed to break out on the opposite end of the street. It was a celebration of liberation. With the board now run by reasonable people, the atmosphere of the neighborhood changed. People started talking to each other more. The fear of a sudden violation notice for a trivial infraction was gone. Kids left their bikes on the lawn for an afternoon, and nobody cared. The community started to feel like a community again, not a military barracks run by a tin pot dictator. My compost pile, the catalyst for the entire revolution, became something of a local landmark. People would stop by while I was working in the yard and ask about it. I found myself giving impromptu lessons on the proper ratio of greens to browns, on the importance of aeration and moisture. John Henderson's tomatoes that next year were in fact spectacular, grown in soil enriched with my rotting filth. Several other neighbors started their own small compost systems, and I was more than happy to help them get started. One afternoon, about 6 months after the special meeting, Dave stopped by while I was turning my pile. The former garden space was no longer a barren patch of dirt. We had reseeded it with native grasses and wildflowers, turning it into a natural meadow that attracted bees and butterflies instead of rats. Quite a turnout for the fall cleanup day, he said, leaning on the fence. We'd organized a volunteer day to clear brush from the woodland edge, and more than 50 people had shown up. People are happy to pitch in when they feel like they're part of something, not just being dictated to, I said, sinking my pitchfork into the rich, dark humus. Funny how that works. Dave nodded, looking at my compost pile. You know, the board has been talking. We have a small surplus in the budget now that we're not spending it on frivolous legal threats. We were thinking of starting a new community garden next spring, a smaller one on the other side of the green. But this time, we want to do it right. He looked at me, a smile playing on his lips. We were wondering if you'd be willing to design and oversee a proper community composting program for it. A real one that actually works. I stopped, resting my hands on the pitchfork, and looked from my own thriving pile of black gold to the new meadow where Karen's toxic kingdom once stood. The sun was warm on my back, and the air smelled clean and sweet. The cycle was complete. The waste of the old regime had been cleared away, and in its place, something new and healthy was ready to grow. "Dave," I said with a grin, "I'd be honored." The battle had been long and stressful, a campaign I never wanted to fight. But standing there, I realized we had won more than just a victory over a bully. We had reclaimed our homes, our rights, and our community. We had torn down the structures of petty tyranny and replaced them with cooperation and common sense. And it all started here, with a simple pile of leaves and coffee grounds, and the stubborn refusal to let a bully tell me what to do on my own land. The war was over, and the peace was better than I could have ever imagined. The new era in Whispering Pines was one of quiet collaboration. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership. The HOA meetings, once dreaded events of public shaming, became productive discussions. We talked about things that actually mattered: organizing a neighborhood watch, planning a summer block party, the best way to deal with the deer that kept eating everyone's tulips. Dave was a natural leader, not because he craved power, but because he listened. He treated the HOA not as his personal kingdom, but as a service organization whose customers were the residents. My role on the board was that of the technical advisor, the voice of reason and process. When a resident had an issue, my first question was always, what does the bylaw say, and is the bylaw itself reasonable? More often than not, this led to us refining the rules to be clearer and fairer, rather than just blindly enforcing them. The community garden project moved forward, but cautiously and correctly. We surveyed the residents to gauge interest. We selected a new site with better sun and drainage, and we designed it from the ground up with sustainability in mind. My biggest contribution was, of course, the composting system. I designed a 3-bay system based on my own, but scaled up for community use. It was built from sturdy, rot-resistant cedar, with proper ventilation and front access panels that made turning the pile easy. But the most important part wasn't the structure. It was the education. I held 2 weekend workshops in the clubhouse, open to anyone who wanted a plot in the new garden. I didn't just tell them what to do, I explained the why. I talked about the carbon to nitrogen ratio, the importance of shredding materials, the signs of a healthy aerobic pile versus a foul anaerobic one. I created a large laminated sign that we posted next to the new bins, with clear lists of greens, nitrogen, and browns, carbon, and a simple rule: for every bucket of greens, add 2 buckets of browns. People were receptive. They were eager to learn. They had seen firsthand the consequences of doing it wrong. The memory of the $60,000 cleanup was a powerful motivator. The new garden thrived. It became a hub of community activity, a place where neighbors connected, sharing tips and trading produce. The compost we generated was rich and beautiful, and it fueled incredible growth. We had a best tomato contest, which John Henderson won, much to his delight. He gave me half the credit, which I refused, but I did accept a few of the winning specimens. They were delicious. I found a deep satisfaction in this new role. My 20 years as an engineer had been about building things to solve problems in often hostile environments. Now I was using those same skills to build community, to solve problems in a place I called home. It was a different kind of mission, but no less rewarding. One day I was at the new garden, helping a young couple understand why they shouldn't put meat scraps in the compost bin, when a car I didn't recognize pulled up. A woman got out, looking to be in her late 40s. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for a Mr. Marcus Jensen." "That's me," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "My name is Susan," she said, extending a hand. "I just bought a house over on Elm Street, the one that used to belong to Karen." We shook hands. "Welcome to the neighborhood," as Dorothy said. "My realtor," she continued, a wry smile on her face, "told me a sort of legendary story about you and the last HOA president. Something about a compost pile and an army of rats." I chuckled. "Something like that." "Well," she said, "I'm a biologist. I've been composting for years. And when I saw the bylaws, the section encouraging it, providing guidelines, I have to say I've never seen an HOA be so progressive. It's one of the reasons I chose this neighborhood. I figured it must be run by sane, rational people." It was perhaps the greatest compliment I could have received. The battle with Karen had been ugly and personal, but the outcome was a systemic change that would outlast all of us. We had created a better, more logical framework for our community. Her legacy was a $60,000 hole in the ground and a cautionary tale. My legacy, I hoped, was a clear, sensible rulebook and some really good soil. "We try," I said to Susan. "If you need a hand getting your system set up, just let me know." "I'd appreciate that," she said. "And if you ever need someone to help teach one of those composting workshops, I'd be happy to volunteer." And just like that, our community grew a little stronger. The cycle continued, new residents bringing new energy, building on the foundation we had fought so hard to lay. The old wounds had healed, and from them, something better had grown. It was a good feeling. It was the feeling of a mission accomplished. Months turned into a year, then two. The story of Karen became a piece of neighborhood lore, a cautionary tale told to new residents about how things used to be. The community garden produced an abundance of vegetables, the wildflower meadow buzzed with life, and the HOA reserve fund was slowly but surely being replenished. Dave Sterling proved to be an excellent president, fair and level-headed, and the board worked together like a well-oiled machine. My compost pile, the humble instigator of the revolution, continued its quiet work in my backyard, turning my lawn clippings and kitchen scraps into the black gold that fed my garden. It was a symbol of the quiet, persistent, and ultimately transformative power of doing things the right way. One Saturday morning, I was in my workshop, sanding a piece of oak for a new bookshelf, when Sarah came in holding a letter. "This came in the mail," she said, her expression unreadable. "It's from a law firm." My heart gave a slight jolt. For a second, the old battle instincts flared up. Was Karen trying something new? Had she found some ambulance-chasing lawyer to cook up a new harassment suit? I took the letter from her. The envelope was thick and expensive. The return address was a prestigious-looking firm downtown. I slit it open with a utility knife and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was an invitation. The State Association of Homeowners Associations was holding its annual conference. The theme for this year was modernizing bylaws for sustainable communities. The letter stated that they had heard about the innovative changes we had made to our bylaws in Whispering Pines, specifically regarding environmental practices like composting and rainwater collection. They were inviting me as a board member and the architect of those changes to be a keynote speaker. They wanted me to share our story, the conflict, the resolution, and the new framework we had created. They were offering to pay me a speaker's fee and cover all expenses. I read the letter twice, then handed it to Sarah. She read it, and a slow smile spread across her face. "A keynote speaker," she said, her eyes shining. "They want you to teach other HOAs how not to be run by people like Karen." The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with a saw. The very organization that implicitly empowers people like Karen by promoting boilerplate, restrictive bylaws, now wanted me to come and teach them how to do the opposite. The man she had tried to fine into oblivion was now being celebrated as an innovator in her field. "What do you think?" I asked Sarah. "I think you have to do it," she said firmly. "Think of all the other people out there, in other neighborhoods dealing with their own Karens. This is a chance to help them, to show them there's a better way." She was right. The battle for Whispering Pines was won, but the war against petty tyranny was being fought in cul-de-sacs and clubhouses all over the country. Sharing our story wasn't about gloating or revenge. It was about exporting our victory. It was about turning our hard-won peace into a blueprint for others. I accepted the invitation. I spent the next month preparing my speech. I didn't focus on the drama or the personal conflict. I focused on the process. I structured my presentation like an engineering brief. Problem: overly restrictive, subjective bylaws leading to conflict and abuse of power. Analysis: case study, the Whispering Pines compost conflict. I detailed the financial and social costs of the old way. Solution: the development of objective, evidence-based, and community-oriented bylaws. I provided examples from our new rulebook, explaining the logic behind each one. The conference was held in a large hotel ballroom. It was filled with hundreds of HOA board members, property managers, and lawyers from all over the state. As I stood at the podium looking out at the sea of faces, I saw dozens of Karens, men and women, all with that same look of stern, self-important authority. But I also saw others, people who looked tired and frustrated, people who looked like they were genuinely searching for a better way. I told our story. I showed the pictures of my compost pile, the picture of Karen's disastrous garden, the yellow caution tape, the final bill for the cleanup. I put our old, vague bylaw on the screen next to our new clear one. I didn't mention Karen by name. I just referred to her as the former president. The story was more powerful without it. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, just like there had been in the clubhouse meeting. Then the applause started. It was thunderous. After my speech, I was mobbed. People crowded around me, asking for copies of our bylaws, asking for advice on how to handle their own boards, how to fight their own unjust fines. One woman, with tears in her eyes, told me about her fight to get a wheelchair ramp approved for her disabled son. A man told me about his battle over installing solar panels. They were all fighting their own versions of my war. I spent 2 hours talking to them, sharing what I had learned, offering encouragement. I realized then that the fight with Karen had prepared me for a new mission, one I had never expected. It had turned me from a quiet veteran into an advocate. As I was leaving, a man in an expensive suit, the president of the state association, shook my hand. "That was one of the most impactful presentations we've ever had, Mr. Jensen," he said. "You've given a lot of people here a lot to think about. You've shown us that protecting property values and building a strong community don't have to be mutually exclusive. In fact, you've shown us they're one and the same." Driving home, I felt a profound sense of closure. Karen's attack had been meant to isolate and punish me, but in the end, it had propelled me onto a stage where I could help countless others. Her attempt to enforce a narrow, sterile conformity had inadvertently sparked a movement toward a more sensible, sustainable, and humane way of living together. I had won the battle for my compost pile, but in doing so, I had helped to win a much bigger victory for common sense and decency, and that was a legacy worth fighting for.